You actually think you deserve half of what I built? Look at yourself." Daniel Whitmore said it loud enough for every person in that courtroom to hear. Then he leaned back in his chair, looked his wife of 18 years up and down like she was something that had wandered in from the street, and laughed, full and open and completely without shame. His attorney smiled, his associates smirked. Emily Whitmore sat perfectly still. She did not cry, she did not look away. She simply placed both hands on top of an old leather folder and said nothing, because she didn't need to say anything yet. What was inside that folder was going to say everything. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and follow along until the very last word. And drop a comment below. Tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning of the Whitmore divorce hearing started the way Daniel liked most things to start, with him in control. He arrived at the Cook County Courthouse in a black car with tinted windows, stepping out in a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. His attorney, Graham Pierce, the kind of lawyer whose name appeared in Chicago Magazine's Top 50 Power Players list 3 years running, walked half a step behind him, already reviewing notes on a leather-bound tablet. Daniel didn't look nervous. He looked like a man arriving at a victory celebration he had already planned. "We're going to be done by noon," he told Graham, straightening his cufflinks as they walked toward the entrance. "I want to be back in the office by 1. Graham gave him a careful look. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Daniel." "I'm not getting ahead of anything," Daniel said. "I'm just being realistic. What is she going to say? What does she even have?" He didn't wait for an answer. He already knew what he believed. Emily had nothing. Emily had never had anything. That was the story Daniel had been telling himself for years, and by this point he had told it so many times it felt like history, like fact, like something carved in stone. Inside the courtroom, Daniel's team arranged themselves with the quiet confidence of people who had done this before and won before. Graham set out folders with color-coded tabs. A junior associate arranged exhibits in numbered order. A paralegal double-checked page references. It looked less like a legal proceeding and more like a corporate presentation, which was exactly the impression Daniel wanted to create. I wanted the judge to see a man who built things, a man who organized things, a man who created value from nothing. He glanced across the room. Emily was already seated at the opposing table. She looked exactly the way he expected her to look. She was wearing a navy blue coat, not new, not designer, the kind of coat a woman buys because it's practical and keeps her warm. Her hair was pulled back simply. There were no jewelry pieces worth noticing, no statement accessories, nothing that announced wealth or power or importance. She had one folder on the table in front of her, old brown leather worn at the corners, the kind that looked like it had been carried through many years and many rooms. It was closed. She had both hands resting on top of it quietly, the way someone holds something they're not willing to let go of. Beside her sat her attorney, Thomas Caldwell. Daniel had done his research on Thomas Caldwell. He always did his research. Thomas was 63 years old, a solo practitioner who had spent most of his career doing estate law, wills, trusts, inheritance disputes. He didn't advertise. He didn't have a firm with 20 associates. He had a small office in the West Loop, a reputation for being thorough, and absolutely no profile in the kinds of circles Daniel moved in. Daniel had looked at his picture online and immediately felt better. The man looked like a retired school teacher. He wore a suit that was perfectly respectable and absolutely unremarkable. His briefcase was old. His reading glasses were slightly bent at one arm. Daniel had almost smiled when he saw him. He almost smiled again now, because across that courtroom, the entire opposing side looked like people who had already accepted a loss and were simply going through the motions of a process they couldn't stop. The judge entered. Everyone rose, everyone sat, and the proceeding began. Graham Pierce opened for Daniel's side with the kind of polished, controlled delivery that makes expensive attorneys worth their fee. He outlined the assets clearly. The real estate holdings across 3 states. The development company Whitmore Group, which had grown from a small operation in Daniel's late 20s into one of Chicago's most recognized mid-sized development firms. The investment accounts, the partnership interests, the commercial properties. Nearly $60 million in total documented assets. Graham's argument was elegant in its simplicity. Daniel had built all of it. "Your Honor," Graham said, his voice measured and authoritative, Mr. Whitmore is the founder of every business entity in question. He is the sole managing partner of Whitmore Group. Every strategic decision, every risk taken, every relationship cultivated. These were the product of Mr. Whitmore's intelligence, his work ethic, and his vision. Mrs. Whitmore, while a supportive spouse during the early years of the marriage, did not participate in the construction of these assets in any material business sense. He paused for effect. She was in the most respectful terms a homemaker and a supporter, which is a valuable role, but it is not the role of a business co-founder, and the law must distinguish between those two things. Daniel nodded very slightly, just enough to feel it. He thought that sounded right. He thought that sounded exactly right. He glanced over at Emily. She was looking at the judge, not at Graham, not at Daniel. Her expression was quiet and focused, the way a person looks when they are listening to something they have heard before and are waiting for the part that matters. She wasn't crying. Daniel had half expected her to cry. Emily used to cry, not often and never for show. She was not a dramatic person, but in the early years when things were hard and they fought about money and fear and exhaustion, there were tears, quiet ones, the kind she wiped away quickly because she didn't want him to see them as weakness. He used to hold her when she cried. He couldn't quite remember when he had stopped doing that. The thought passed through him like a draft through a window left open cold, for just a second, then gone. He redirected his attention to Graham, who was wrapping up the opening statement with a clean summary of what Daniel's team was proposing. A settlement offer had been extended prior to this hearing, a lump payment that Graham described as generous and reflective of Mrs. Whitmore's contributions to the household. It was not generous. Emily's attorney had rejected it within 48 hours. That was when Daniel had first felt a small flicker of something unfamiliar. Not quite worry, more like irritation. The kind a person feels when something they expected to be simple turns out to require more effort than planned. He had asked Graham why she rejected it. Graham had said carefully, her attorney sent back a note indicating that Mrs. Whitmore believes the offer does not reflect an accurate picture of the marital assets. What does that mean? Daniel had asked. It means she thinks there's more to discuss, Graham had said. Daniel had shrugged. Let her discuss it in court then. Let her stand up in front of a judge and explain what she thinks she contributed. I'll be interested to hear it. And now here they were. The judge acknowledged Graham's opening statement and turned to the opposing table. Mr. Caldwell, the judge said, you're opening. Thomas Caldwell stood slowly like a man who had learned a long time ago that there was no advantage in moving faster than necessary. He buttoned his jacket. He adjusted his glasses. He picked up a single sheet of paper from the table, looked at it briefly, and set it back down. Then he looked at the judge. Your Honor, he said, and his voice was unhurried, quiet, and completely clear. Before we begin discussing the division of the marital estate, I'd like to address a foundational question. Because I believe with respect that the portrait Mr. Pierce has painted of this marriage is missing its most important element. Graham smiled politely, the smile of a man who is not worried. The question is not simply what Mr. Whitmore built, Thomas continued. The question is what he built it with, and where that foundation came from, and who exactly provided it. He paused, not for drama, just to let that sentence breathe. Daniel felt something move in his chest, something small and cold. Your Honor, Thomas said, we will demonstrate today that the financial foundation of Whitmore Group, the capital that kept it alive during its most critical period of development, the period during which Mr. Whitmore has described in multiple interviews as the years that made me, that capital came directly from one source. He looked at Emily, his wife. The courtroom was not loud to begin with. Courtrooms rarely are. But in that moment, whatever ambient sound existed, the shuffle of papers, the distant click of a paralegal's keyboard, the ventilation hum from somewhere above the ceiling tiles, all of it seemed to go quiet. Daniel's jaw tightened. He leaned toward Graham and said very quietly, "What is he talking about?" Graham kept his expression neutral, but said equally quietly, "Let's hear him out." "I know what he's going to say," Daniel said. "She worked when we were struggling. I've never denied that. She had a job, she paid some bills. I acknowledged that in the settlement offer." "Daniel," Graham said, keeping his voice low and controlled, "let the man finish." Daniel sat back. He crossed his arms. He told himself this was theater. This was what attorneys did. They built up small things to look like big things. They created narratives. They manufactured importance from ordinary circumstances. He told himself Thomas Caldwell was very good at making nothing look like something. He told himself Emily had nothing. He had been telling himself that for 18 years. Thomas returned to his table and opened the worn leather folder that Emily had set in front of him. He withdrew a document and handed it to the court clerk. "Your Honor, I'm submitting Exhibit 1, a certified copy of the Hargrove Family Estate Trust document executed in 1987 and amended in 2003 following the death of Margaret Hargrove, Emily Whitmore's maternal grandmother." Daniel blinked. He knew the name Hargrove. Of course he knew the name Hargrove. Anyone in Chicago's financial community knew the Hargrove name. Hargrove Manufacturing had been one of the region's foundational industrial companies. The kind of American business that didn't make headlines anymore because the headlines had already been written decades ago, in the era when American manufacturing meant something different than it did now. The kind of company that had left behind trusts, endowments, and quiet generational wealth that didn't show up in magazines because the people who held it didn't need magazines to tell them they were wealthy. But that was a different Hargrove. That had to be a different Hargrove. She was from a quiet family, a normal family. Her mother had been a school teacher. Her father had worked in municipal planning. They lived in a modest house in Evanston. There was nothing about Emily's background that had ever suggested the trust. Thomas continued, his voice carrying clearly through the now very attentive room, held assets valued in the 2003 amendment at approximately $240 million. These assets included property holdings, investment accounts, and a controlling interest in Hargrove Industrial Partners, a holding company managing the legacy assets of Hargrove Manufacturing. Daniel heard the number, $240 million. He heard it the way a person hears news that doesn't immediately make sense, like words in a language you almost speak, where you catch every individual word, but the sentence still doesn't connect. Graham beside him had stopped writing. "Emily Whitmore," Thomas said, "is the primary beneficiary of the Hargrove Family Estate Trust. She has been since the death of her grandmother in 2003. Daniel turned and looked at Emily. She was looking at the judge. She had the same quiet, focused expression she'd had throughout Graham's entire opening statement. The same careful stillness, the same unhurried posture. She did not look at Daniel. She didn't need to. "Your Honor," Thomas said, "I also want to submit Exhibit 2. He withdrew another document and handed it to the clerk. "This is a record of a private loan made in the amount of $1.2 million from Emily Whitmore, drawing from her personal inheritance account to the operating account of Whitmore Group, LLC at the time, called Whitmore Development Partners, in March of 2009. March of 2009. Daniel's hands went flat on the table. He remembered March of 2009. He remembered it the way you remember the worst month of your life when you have been fortunate enough to only have one worst month. He remembered sitting at the kitchen table at midnight, looking at bank statements, trying to figure out how to make payroll for 11 employees when the accounts had enough for 7. He remembered a development project that had stalled because a financing partner had pulled out at the worst possible moment. He remembered feeling like everything he had worked for was about to come apart. He remembered Emily sitting across from him. He remembered her saying, "We're going to be okay." He had taken that to mean she believed in him. He had taken that to mean she was offering words. The funds were transferred without formal documentation at the time, Thomas said, which Mr. Whitmore may have believed made them a gift. However, our forensic accounting team has traced the transfer in full, $1.2 million, March 14, 2009, from the personal account of Emily Ann Hargrove Whitmore, an account held entirely in her name, entirely from inheritance funds predating the marriage, to the business account of Whitmore Development Partners. He looked up from this document. That infusion of capital allowed Whitmore Group to survive the most critical 6 months of its existence. The project that was in danger of collapse was instead completed. The revenue from that completion funded the next acquisition, and the next, and the next. He let that sit. He was good at letting things sit. "Without that $1.2 million, Thomas said, there is no Whitmore Group. There is no $60 million estate to divide. There is no divorce proceeding of any significance because there is no wealth to dispute." Graham was already leaning across to Daniel, speaking quietly, urgently. Daniel heard him. He heard the words, Something about needing to reframe, needing to counter with the argument that the funds were a marital gift, and therefore part of the marital estate, needing to address the forensic accounting before it got any further. Daniel heard all of it. But the part of his brain that was supposed to process legal strategy had temporarily stopped working, because he was looking at Emily. And for the first time, for the absolute first time, he was seeing her the way you see something when the light changes. When what you thought was a simple shape reveals itself to be something else entirely. When the thing you had been looking at for years suddenly shows you what it actually was. She had given him $1.2 million, not because she had to, not because it was her duty as a spouse, not because she had no choice. She had given it to him because she believed he was worth saving. And he had spent the years since that moment building a life that said she wasn't. There was a moment, brief, barely perceptible, the kind that passes before a person can fully register what they're feeling, where Daniel Whitmore understood exactly what he had done. Not the legal version, not the financial version, the human version. He had taken the most important thing a person could offer, belief, real belief, the kind backed by sacrifice, and he had buried it under ambition and arrogance and the intoxicating noise of success until he couldn't hear it anymore. He had laughed at her this morning. He had laughed at her. The memory of that sound, his own voice loud and dismissive in this same room just an hour ago, came back to him with a physical force, the way embarrassment sometimes does when it arrives too late to prevent the thing that caused it. Thomas Caldwell was still speaking. He was now laying out the full scope of Emily's inheritance, the trust accounts, the property holdings, the Hargrove Industrial Partners shares, the current valuation. Each number was larger than the last. Each one landed in the room like a stone dropping into water, creating rings that spread outward and changed the shape of everything around them. But Daniel had stopped tracking the numbers. He was watching his wife's hands still resting calmly on the table in front of her, and he was thinking about the night in March 2009 when she had sat across from him at that kitchen table and said, "We're going to be okay." He had believed she was comforting him. He had believed she was offering him the only thing she had. He had been right about the second part. He just hadn't understood what she actually had, or what it meant that she chose to give it to him anyway. The judge was speaking now, asking Graham Pierce a procedural question about the forensic accounting documentation. Graham was responding smoothly, professionally, with the composed tone of an attorney recalibrating in real time, but Daniel could see it in the slight tension at the corners of Graham's mouth, in the way his pen had gone still, in the almost imperceptible pause before each sentence. Graham knew. The landscape of this case had just changed completely, and he knew it. A journalist in the gallery. Daniel had seen her come in earlier, recognized her from a publication that covered Chicago business, had stopped whatever casual note-taking she'd been doing, and was writing with intent, now leaning forward slightly the way reporters do when a story becomes something more than what it started as. The junior associate on Daniel's team had opened a new document on her laptop and was typing quickly, quietly, her face careful and neutral, in the way young attorneys learn to make their faces when they understand that the ground has shifted, and they need to process that shift without their expression giving anything away. Even the bailiff, standing to the side of the room with the professionally blank expression of someone who had stood in that spot through hundreds of hearings, had shifted his weight very slightly, the kind of subtle adjustment a person makes when they are paying closer attention than they were a moment ago. The entire room had recalibrated. Everyone in it had come in believing they understood the shape of this story. A wealthy man, a quiet wife, a settlement dispute. The kind of thing that happened every day. And now they were all sitting inside a completely different story, one that had been there the whole time, waiting inside an old leather folder, waiting for the moment when the woman everyone had underestimated decided the time had come to let the truth speak for itself. Emily turned her head and looked at Daniel, just for a moment, just briefly. Her eyes were steady and clear and held something that was not anger and not triumph and not satisfaction. It was something harder to name than any of those things. It was the look of a person who had waited a long time to be seen, and who was finally in this room in front of all these witnesses being seen. Daniel held her gaze for exactly as long as he could stand it. Then he looked away. Thomas Caldwell continued speaking. The documents continued to be submitted. The numbers continued to accumulate on the record. And somewhere in the middle of that courtroom, in the silence between one legal argument and the next, something that had been hidden for 18 years finally stepped fully into the light. Not dramatically, not with music or movement or a moment designed for effect, just quietly, the way Emily Whitmore had always done everything, the way she had always been everything, quietly and with more depth than anyone had bothered to look for. Thomas paused in his presentation and turned one more page in his folder. "Your Honor," he said, "there is one more item I'd like to enter into the record." He withdrew the final document. A letter, written by Emily Whitmore to her grandmother Margaret Hargrove in February of 2009, 1 month before the transfer. Entered into the trust record by Mrs. Hargrove herself, with a notation that it should be preserved. He held it up. In this letter, Emily explains to her grandmother that she intends to use a portion of her inheritance to save her husband's company. She writes that she is doing so, not because he asked her to, but because she believes in what he is trying to build. She describes his dream as worthy of sacrifice. She asks her grandmother's blessing. He set the letter on the clerk's desk. Her grandmother gave it. The courtroom was so quiet that Daniel could hear his own breathing. He heard it, and he hated the sound of it, and he couldn't stop. Thomas returned to his seat beside Emily. Emily looked straight ahead. Daniel looked at the letter, that single page resting on the clerk's desk. A letter from a woman to her grandmother about believing in a man who would one day laugh at her in a courtroom, and he felt something happen inside his chest that had not happened to him in a very long time. Not grief exactly, not shame exactly. Something that contained both of those things and then went further. The recognition of a specific kind of loss. The kind that isn't sudden, that accumulates slowly over years of small choices and smaller negligences. Until one morning you are sitting in a courtroom in a suit that costs more than your conscience, and you understand fully, completely, without the protection of any further illusion, exactly what you had and what you chose to do with it. Graham leaned close to his ear. "Daniel," he said quietly, "we need to talk about a revised approach." Daniel didn't answer right away. He was looking at his wife's hands, still quiet, still resting on the table, still. "Yeah," he said finally, "I know." But inside, in the place beneath strategy and calculation and the long-practiced habit of moving forward without looking back, he already understood that no revision would fix this. Some things once seen cannot be unseen. And the woman he had laughed at this morning had just shown him the whole truth of what he was, not the truth he told at charity dinners, not the truth in press profiles, the other one, the real one, the one that had been waiting inside an old leather folder all along. The recess was called at 11:42 in the morning. Graham Pierce was on his feet before the judge had fully risen from the bench, already moving toward Daniel with the practiced urgency of a man who understood that the next 20 minutes would determine whether this case could be salvaged or whether it was already beyond saving. Daniel didn't wait for him. He walked out of the courtroom ahead of everyone through the heavy wooden door into the corridor and kept walking until he found a corner near a window at the far end of the hall where no one from his team could immediately reach him. He stood there for a moment, his back to the corridor, looking out at nothing in particular. He heard Graham's footsteps behind him. Fast, purposeful, the sound of a man who billed by the hour and understood the value of not wasting time. "Daniel." Graham's voice was low and controlled. "I need you to listen to me carefully." Daniel turned around. "When exactly," he said, "were you going to tell me that this was a possibility?" Graham's expression tightened. "I didn't know. You didn't tell me about any loan in 2009. "Because I didn't know it was a loan," Daniel said. "I thought it was—" He stopped. He pressed his hand against his forehead. "I thought she was supporting us. I thought it was our money. Was it in a joint account?" "No." The word came out flat. "It wasn't." Graham absorbed that. "Then it wasn't your money, Daniel. It was hers. And if it came from an inheritance account that predated the marriage, then under Illinois law—" "I understand Illinois law," Daniel said sharply. "I've been doing business in this state for 20 years. "Then you understand what this means for our position." Daniel looked at him. Graham said it anyway because that was what Daniel was paying him to do. "It means our entire argument that you built the company through your own effort and capital has a significant hole in it, a $1.2 million hole. And her attorney is going to spend the rest of this morning making that hole look like the size of a foundation." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Down the corridor, he could see his junior associate, a young woman named Rachel, who had been with the firm for 3 years and was almost certainly listening to everything while pretending to look at her phone. He could see his paralegal flipping through folders with the focused energy of someone trying to find a document that changes everything. He could see a few people from the gallery who had stepped out during the recess, speaking quietly, their eyes moving toward him and away again, with the careful discretion of people who knew they were watching something they weren't supposed to enjoy watching. He thought about the letter Thomas Caldwell had read into the record. Emily's handwriting. Her words to her grandmother asking for a blessing. He describes his dream as worthy of sacrifice. He had not known about that letter. He had not known about the trust. He had not known, and this was the part that kept returning to him, the part he couldn't organize into something manageable. He had not known because he had never asked. He had never asked Emily about her family's money because he had assumed there was nothing to ask about. Because she had never acted like a woman who came from money. She had never dressed like it, never spoken like it, never used it to create the kind of distance that wealth sometimes puts between people. She had just been Emily, quiet, steady, present Emily. The woman who paid the electric bill when the business account was dry, who made dinner at 10 o'clock at night when he came home too tired to think, who sat beside him on the kitchen floor once he remembered this suddenly, and the memory arrived with a kind of clarity that surprised him. Sat beside him on the kitchen floor during a particularly bad week in 2008, when he had told her he didn't think the company was going to make it, and she had said without hesitation, without drama, without a single word of doubt, "Then we'll figure out what comes next, but it's going to make it." He had thought she was being a good wife. He had not understood she was being something rarer. "Daniel," Graham's voice again, pulling him back, "we need a strategy." "I know. The forensic accounting is going to hold. We can't contest the transfer record. It's documented, it's traceable, and they've already submitted the bank records. What we can do is argue framing. We can argue that in the context of the marriage, the transfer was intended as a contribution to marital assets, which would make it part of the marital estate, rather than a separate investment that entitles her to a claim on the business itself." Daniel looked at him. "You want me to argue," he said slowly, "that the money she gave me was so much mine that it became part of my company, and therefore she gets less of it." Graham held his gaze. "I want to give you the best available legal argument, Daniel. That's my job." "That argument," Daniel said, "is going to sound exactly as ugly as it is." Graham paused. Then, with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned not to let his personal opinion interfere with his professional function, he said, "It might, but it gives us a position." Daniel looked away. He thought about the way the courtroom had gone quiet when Thomas Caldwell said $1.2 million. He thought about the journalist in the gallery leaning forward, writing fast. He thought about Emily's hands on that folder. "How much do they actually know?" he asked. Graham hesitated. That hesitation was its own answer. "How much, Graham?" Graham said carefully, "The forensic accounting team, they used Meridian Financial Group. They're thorough. If they've been working on this since the separation, which the filing timeline suggests they have, then they've had approximately 8 months to trace every transaction, every transfer, every account that touched the business during its first 5 years." Daniel went very still. "Define every transaction," he said. Graham looked at him, and in that look was a question that a good attorney only asks once quietly before a hearing continues, because the answer determines everything that comes after. "Daniel," Graham said, "is there anything else I should know about anything from those early years that might look different in court than it looked at the time?" The corridor was quiet around them. Daniel thought about the years Graham was referencing, the years between 2007 and 2012 when the company was fighting for survival, when money moved through accounts in ways that made sense in the moment and might be harder to explain in a courtroom with a judge watching. He thought about a second transfer. He had almost forgotten about the second transfer. He had told himself over years that he had forgotten about it. But the truth was that you don't forget about the things you carry. You just learn to carry them in a place where they don't show. "There's one more thing," Daniel said. Graham's expression didn't change, but his stillness deepened. "Tell me," Graham said. "In 2011, Daniel said. There was another transfer, smaller, around $300,000. Graham said nothing. He waited. "I told her it was an investment opportunity," Daniel said. "A partnership stake in a commercial property deal. I told her she'd get it back with returns when the deal closed." "And did the deal close?" The pause before Daniel answered was very brief, but it was long enough. "The deal fell through," Daniel said. The partnership dissolved. The money was absorbed into operating expenses to keep the company afloat. He paused again. I never told her. Graham closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Then he opened them and said in the voice of a man who had been practicing law for 30 years and had heard things in corridors and conference rooms that would never appear in any public record. Did she know it was her inheritance money she was investing? She knew it was her personal account, Daniel said. She trusted me to manage the details. And you managed the details by not telling her the deal failed. I managed the details, Daniel said, by making sure the company survived, which it did, because of that money, among other things. Graham looked at him for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, Daniel, if Meridian Financial has traced the first transfer, they have traced the second. There is no version of today where we walk into that courtroom and that number doesn't come up. Daniel felt something move through him. Not panic, he was not a man who panicked easily, but something adjacent to it. The recognition of a position becoming smaller walls, becoming closer options, narrowing to a corridor with fewer and fewer doors. So what do we do? He asked. We go back in there, Graham said, and we listen, and we do not react. Whatever comes out in the next session, whatever number they put on the record, you do not react. You do not laugh. You do not speak unless I tell you to speak. You sit still, and you let me work. Daniel thought about the way he had laughed earlier, the full, open, head-thrown-back laugh, the one that had felt like power. He nodded. They walked back toward the courtroom. And as Daniel pushed through that heavy door and returned to his seat, he was already doing the thing he did best and worst in equal measure, recalculating, recalibrating, running numbers and angles and possibilities through the part of his mind that had learned through years of business to find the margin in a bad situation. But this time the numbers kept landing in the same place, and the place they landed didn't look like a margin. It looked like the truth. On the other side of the room, Emily was already seated. Thomas Caldwell was beside her, speaking quietly, and she was listening with her head slightly tilted, the way she always listened when she was paying real attention. She had a glass of water in front of her. Her hands were in her lap. She did not look at Daniel when he came in. She had spent 18 years being aware of where he was in every room they shared. Some habits take a long time to break, but she had made a decision sometime in the 8 months since he had filed those papers and walked away from their house with 2 suitcases and a certainty that felt to her like something that should have been a conversation, but had instead been a conclusion. She had made a decision that this room was not one she would spend watching him. She had things of her own to pay attention to. The judge returned. The room came to order. Thomas Caldwell stood again. Your Honor, I'd like to continue with the financial timeline. And he did. He continued methodically, document by document, with the quiet thoroughness of a man who had spent 8 months preparing exactly this presentation for exactly this moment. He walked the court through the early years of Whitmore Development Partners, the initial capitalization which Daniel had funded through a combination of personal savings and a small business loan. The first 18 months of operation, during which the company generated modest revenue and almost no profit. The moment in late 2008 when the financing environment tightened and 2 of Daniel's key investors pulled back simultaneously. He paused on that moment. Let it sit. At this point, Thomas said, according to the company's own financial records, Whitmore Development Partners had enough operating capital to sustain itself for approximately 90 days. He looked up at the courtroom. 90 days, and no new financing in sight. He submitted another document. This is a record of Daniel Whitmore's communications with 11 separate lending institutions and private equity contacts between October 2008 and February 2009. Every one of them declined to extend new financing. The reasons cited include market conditions, insufficient collateral, and I quote from one rejection letter, an optimistic business model that does not reflect current economic realities. Somewhere behind Daniel, someone let out a breath. In February 2009, Thomas continued, Daniel Whitmore came home from the last of those meetings, and he sat at his kitchen table across from his wife, and he told her the truth. He paused. He told her the company was in serious trouble. He told her he didn't know if it was going to survive. And Emily Whitmore, a woman who had been working as a museum research coordinator for 6 years, who drove a 7-year-old car, who had never mentioned to her husband that her grandmother had left her the beneficiary of a trust worth hundreds of millions of dollars, Emily Whitmore said, We're going to be okay." The courtroom was very quiet. And then she went to her personal bank, alone, without telling Daniel where the money was coming from or how much was behind it. She withdrew $1.2 million, and she saved his company. Thomas let that sentence finish completely before he moved on. "She didn't tell him about the trust," Thomas continued, "not because she was hiding it, but because she had grown up in a family that believed money was a private matter, that wealth was not something you announced, and that a person's value had nothing to do with what they had inherited." Emily's grandmother, Margaret Hargrove, had raised her with a very specific philosophy. "What you have," Margaret used to say, "is not who you are. What you give is." He looked at Emily briefly. Emily was looking at her hands. "So Emily gave," Thomas said, "without announcement, without expectation of return, without even framing it in her own mind as a sacrifice. She gave because she believed in her husband, because she believed in his dream, because she had made a promise 18 years earlier to stand beside him." He walked back to the table. "And now we are in a courtroom," he said, "where the man she saved is arguing that she contributed nothing significant to his success." He said it without inflection, without editorial weight, just the fact stated plainly. It landed like a stone. Daniel did not react. He had promised Graham he would not react. He sat still, and he kept his expression composed, and he did not allow himself to look at Emily, because he already knew with a certainty that had been building in him since Thomas first stood up that morning, that if he looked at her right now, he would not be able to maintain any of the things he needed to maintain in order to get through the rest of this day professionally. Graham leaned close. "Holding up." Daniel gave the smallest possible nod. Graham said quietly, "The second transfer is coming." He was right. Thomas had organized this presentation the way a skilled storyteller organizes a story, not chronologically for its own sake, but in the order that builds the most complete picture. He had established Emily's character first, her restraint, her generosity, her silence. He had established the first transfer and its consequences. He had let the room sit with the image of a woman who gave $1.2 million without asking for credit. And now he was going to give them the second part of the story, the part that was harder. In 2011, Thomas said, Whitmore Group, by then operating under its current name, was again facing a liquidity challenge. Not a crisis this time, but a significant gap. An opportunity had emerged for a commercial acquisition that would have completed substantially grow the company's portfolio. The acquisition required a capital commitment that exceeded the company's current liquid assets. He submitted another set of documents to the clerk. Daniel Whitmore approached his wife. He told her there was an investment opportunity, a partnership stake in a commercial property deal. He told her the return on investment would be strong. He told her she would get her money back with returns when the deal closed. He paused. He asked her to contribute $300,000 from her personal account. He looked at the courtroom. She did. He let that sit. The deal did not close. The partnership dissolved in early 2012. The $300,000 was absorbed into Whitmore Group's operating expenses. He turned one more page. Emily Whitmore was not informed of this outcome. Not in 2012. Not in 2013. Not in any of the years between then and now. She believed until our forensic accounting team discovered the transaction record 8 months ago that the investment was still pending resolution. The room shifted. Not loudly, but perceptibly. The journalist in the gallery had stopped writing and was just watching. The junior associate on Daniel's side had gone completely still. Graham's pen was motionless. She didn't know, Thomas said quietly. She trusted her husband to manage the details, and her husband managed the details by not telling her that her money was gone. He closed the folder. He did not editorialize. He did not express outrage or ask the court to be outraged. He simply stated what happened and let it exist in the room. And then he sat down. And the room was so quiet that Daniel could hear his own heartbeat. Emily turned her head and looked at Daniel. Not the quick, measured look from before. This was longer. And what was in it was not anger he had expected anger. What was in it was something that anger had already passed through and moved beyond. Something quieter, and in its quietness far more devastating. It was the look of a person who had learned something she had suspected but not confirmed, and who was now in the particular stillness of having confirmation. She had not known about the second transfer, not the truth of it. She had trusted him, and he had managed the details. He held her gaze this time. He didn't look away. He owed her that much. He didn't know exactly when he had arrived at that conclusion, but somewhere between Graham's words in the corridor and Thomas's last sentence in the courtroom, he had arrived at it. He owed her the honesty of not looking away, so he didn't. And after a moment, Emily turned back to face the front of the room. She did not speak. She did not cry. She did not perform any of the emotions that the situation would have justified. She simply turned back. And that quiet dignity, that absolute refusal to give the moment more theater than it deserved, was the thing that finally cracked something open in Daniel's chest that he had been keeping closed for a very long time. The judge was speaking. Procedural language about evidence and scheduling. Graham was responding. The machinery of the legal process continued to turn. Daniel sat inside it and felt for the first time in longer than he could remember completely without defense, not legally, not professionally, as a person. He thought about the night Emily had sat beside him on the kitchen floor in 2008 and told him it was going to be okay. He thought about the letter she had written to her grandmother. He describes his dream as worthy of sacrifice. I thought about every morning she had woken up in the years after the company became successful, after the parties, and the recognition and the profile features, and the new social circles, and been herself. Quietly, stubbornly, without apology herself. The books on her nightstand. The Saturday mornings at the farmer's market. The way she still called her mother every Sunday at noon and talked for an hour, not about money or success, but about recipes and neighborhood news and small, ordinary things that kept a person anchored to what actually mattered. He had seen all of that as simplicity. He had seen it as evidence that she wasn't growing at the same rate he was. He had seen it as something to be slightly embarrassed by at dinner parties when she talked about the museum or mentioned a book that nobody else at the table had read. He had seen, in other words, exactly the wrong thing. And now he was sitting in a courtroom in a suit that cost more than she spent on herself in a year, having just heard a stranger describe the full shape of who she actually was. And the stranger had done a better job of seeing her than Daniel had in the last decade of their marriage. That thought arrived with the weight of something that cannot be put back down once you've picked it up. He pulled a piece of paper toward him and wrote a single sentence on it. He folded it. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he slid it across the table to Graham. Graham looked at him. Daniel nodded toward the opposing table. Graham read the note. His expression shifted. He looked at Daniel with the particular expression of an attorney who has just been asked to do something that is not in his client's legal interest and who is trying to determine whether his client understands that. "Daniel," Graham said quietly, "think about what you're asking." "I have thought about it," Daniel said. "This changes our position completely." "I know what it changes." Graham held his gaze for a beat. Then he folded the note and placed it on the table between them. "All right," he said. He raised his hand to address the judge. And Daniel Whitmore, for the first time in this proceeding, did something that his attorney had not prepared for, that his team had not planned for, and that every person in that courtroom had not expected from the man who had walked in that morning with tinted windows and a noon departure schedule. He asked to speak, not through counsel, directly. The judge looked at him with the measured attention of someone who had heard many unexpected requests and knew that unexpected requests in divorce proceedings were rarely good news for the person making them. "Mr. Whitmore," the judge said, "you're aware that speaking directly in this context is unusual and that anything you say becomes part of the record." "Yes, Your Honor," Daniel said. His voice was steady. He had built a company partly on the ability to keep his voice steady when he was anything but. "I'd like to say something," he said, "not as a legal argument, just as—" He paused. He found the word. "As the truth." The judge looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "You may proceed." Daniel stood. He did not have notes. He did not have a prepared statement. He had a single folded piece of paper that contained one sentence, and he had the 18 years of a marriage, and he had the last 3 hours of a courtroom, and he had the particular kind of clarity that sometimes only comes when everything you built your self-image on has been quietly, methodically, and permanently dismantled by a woman in a navy blue coat with an old leather folder. He looked at Emily. She looked back at him. "I laughed this morning," he said, "in this room, at you." He did not look away. "I want to say something about that." Every person in that courtroom stopped breathing at the same moment. Not because Daniel Whitmore standing up to speak was a legal event. It wasn't. It was procedurally unusual, mildly irregular, and the kind of thing that experienced court watchers recognized immediately as either a breakthrough or a catastrophic mistake with very little ground in between. They stopped breathing because of the way he was looking at his wife, not with the confidence he had carried into the room that morning, not with the rehearsed composure of a man performing strength for an audience, with something rawer than either of those things, something that had no professional finish on it. Emily looked back at him. She did not help him. She did not soften her expression to make it easier for him to say whatever he was about to say. She simply looked at him the way she had been looking at things her whole life, clearly, without flinching, willing to see whatever was actually there. Daniel said, "I laughed at you this morning, in this room, in front of all these people." He paused. "I want to say something about that." The room held its stillness. "I laughed," he said, "because I was certain. I was absolutely certain that I knew everything about this situation. I knew what I had built. I knew what you had contributed. I knew how this day was going to go." He stopped, took a breath. "I was wrong." Graham Pierce beside him did not move. His pen was on the table. His folder was closed. He had the expression of a man who had accepted in the last several minutes that his role in this proceeding had fundamentally changed, and that the best thing he could do now was be very quiet and very still. "Not wrong about the business," Daniel said. "I built the business. I made the decisions. I carried the weight of it for 20 years, and I won't stand here and pretend that wasn't real." He paused again. "But I was wrong about where the foundation came from, and I was wrong—" He stopped. Something moved through his face that he didn't try to hide. "I was wrong about you." Emily's expression did not change, but something in her posture shifted almost imperceptibly. The slight adjustment of a person who has been braced for impact and is recalibrating in real time. "I told people for years that I was a self-made man," Daniel said. "I believed it. I put it in interviews. I built an identity around it." He looked at his hands briefly, then back at Emily. "But a self-made man doesn't have a wife who goes to her personal bank account and pulls out $1.2 million because she believes in him more than anyone else does." He said the number out loud deliberately, without minimizing it. "That's not a supportive spouse," he said. "That's a partner. That's someone who bet everything on a person who didn't fully understand what he was being given." Thomas Caldwell across the room had not moved since Daniel began speaking. He was watching with the careful attention of an attorney who has learned that the most important thing to do in an unexpected moment is to do nothing and let it complete itself. "The 300,000, Daniel said, in 2011. He said it without prompting, without anyone asking him to address it. He said it because it was there in the room in the record, and because the only thing that felt honest at this point was to say it himself rather than have it extracted from him. "I told you it was an investment," he said to Emily directly. "I told you you'd get it back." Emily said nothing, but her eyes were on him, fully on him, with an intensity that was not accusation so much as the final stages of attention, the way a person looks at something they have been trying to understand for a long time and are finally beginning to. "The deal fell apart," Daniel said, "and I didn't tell you. I told myself it wasn't the right time. I told myself I'd fix it before it mattered. I told myself a lot of things." He stopped. "None of them were true. The true thing is that I was ashamed, and I didn't know how to be ashamed in front of you without it changing how you saw me." His voice was steady. He had built 20 years of professional life on keeping his voice steady in difficult rooms. But the steadiness now was a different kind. Not performance, just the flat, exposed surface of something that had been covered for too long. "I needed you to keep seeing me as the person who had everything under control," he said, "because that's what I needed to be. For you, for everyone. And telling you the truth would have meant admitting that I didn't have it under control, and I couldn't do that." He paused. "So I didn't, and I'm sorry." The silence in the room was complete. Somewhere in the gallery someone shifted in their seat. The sound was very small, but in that silence it was loud. The judge was watching Daniel with an expression that was impossible to read neutral in the specific way that experienced judges are neutral, which is to say, attentive without betraying response. Thomas Caldwell finally moved. He leaned very slightly toward Emily and said something very quietly in her ear. She listened. She gave the smallest possible nod. She did not take her eyes off Daniel. Daniel looked at his wife. "I'm not saying this to change the outcome of today," he said. "I understand what today is. I understand what the law says and what the record shows and what you're entitled to." He glanced at Graham briefly. "I understand all of it." He looked back at Emily. "I'm saying it because you spent 18 years in a marriage where I stopped seeing you, and this morning I laughed at you in a room full of people because I thought you had nothing. And I need you to know that I understand right now in this room how catastrophically wrong that was." He sat down. The room remained quiet for a moment longer than felt natural. Then the judge spoke. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. Mr. Caldwell, do you wish to continue with your presentation?" Thomas stood. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, "if I may." He picked up his folder and found his place with the efficiency of a man who had prepared for many possible versions of this day, including this one. "Your Honor," he said, "I appreciate Mr. Whitmore's statement, and I want to make clear that Mrs. Whitmore's position today is not about punishment. It is not about humiliation. It is about accuracy." He paused. "An accurate accounting of what this marriage was, what it produced, and what both parties contributed to it." He withdrew another set of documents, and here was the part of the morning that Daniel had not seen coming. Not because Thomas was going to reveal another financial transfer, not because there was another account, another transaction, another number that would change the picture. What Thomas was about to present had nothing to do with money. "Your Honor," Thomas said, "I'd like to submit into the record a series of documents relating to the professional history of Emily Hargrove Whitmore, specifically her career prior to and during the marriage." Daniel frowned slightly. Emily's career. She had worked at the Newberry Library as a research coordinator. She had done that for 12 years. It was a respectable position, a quiet one, not the kind that made headlines. He knew this. He had always known this. He had in the early years been proud of her commitment to it. Later, he had seen it as evidence of a certain lack of ambition, a settling a choice to stay small in a life that could have been larger. He was about to be wrong about this, too. "Mrs. Whitmore holds a master's degree in archival studies from the University of Chicago," Thomas said, submitting the first document. "She graduated first in her cohort. She was offered a doctoral fellowship, which she declined." Daniel had known about the master's degree. He had not known she had been offered the fellowship. She had never mentioned the fellowship. "She joined the Newberry Library in 2001, Thomas continued. "In 2003, the same year her grandmother passed away, and she became the primary beneficiary of the Hargrove Trust, she was offered a position as Director of Acquisitions at the library." Daniel's frown deepened. Director of Acquisitions. He had not known about that. "She declined that position as well," Thomas said. "The reason documented in the library's internal records, which we obtained with Mrs. Whitmore's permission, is that she did not feel she could commit to the increased travel and hours required by the directorship, while also supporting her husband's business in its early critical stages." The room was paying close attention. Daniel was paying very close attention. In 2005, she was offered a consulting contract by the Smithsonian Institution. In 2007, she received an inquiry from the Library of Congress regarding a curatorial fellowship. In 2009, the same year, she transferred $1.2 million to her husband's company. She was shortlisted for a position as head of special collections at a private foundation in New York. Thomas placed each document on the clerk's desk as he named it. She declined all of them. He looked at the courtroom. Not because she wasn't qualified, not because she wasn't interested, because in her own words in a letter she wrote to a colleague in 2007, which her colleague provided to us, "Daniel's work needs to come first right now. There'll be time for my things later." He closed the folder. "There wasn't," he said simply. By the time the company was established enough that Daniel no longer needed the same level of daily support, the opportunities had passed. The Smithsonian had moved on. The Library of Congress Fellowship had been filled. The New York position had gone to someone else. He looked at the judge. "Your Honor, what I want the record to reflect is this. Emily Whitmore did not simply provide financial capital to this marriage. She provided strategic sacrifice. She gave up a professional trajectory that by any reasonable measure would have made her one of the most recognized figures in her field. She did this quietly, without complaint, without keeping score, and without ever asking her husband to understand the full cost of what she was giving up." He paused. "He didn't know," Thomas said, "because she never told him, because that was the kind of person she was, the kind who gives without making the giving into a transaction." He sat down. The room shifted again, and Daniel Whitmore sat in the middle of that shift and felt the accumulated weight of everything that had been placed on the record in the last 2 hours settle onto him with a finality that was impossible to argue with. She had given up the fellowship, the directorship, the Smithsonian contract, the Library of Congress, the New York position. She had given them up for him, and he had never known. Not because she had hidden it, because she had considered it private. Her sacrifice, her choice, her contribution to a marriage she believed in. She had not needed him to know because she had not been doing it for credit. She had been doing it because she loved him and because she thought that was what love looked like, choosing the other person's dream alongside your own until the right time came for yours. The right time had never come. And he had responded to all of that, to the money, to the sacrificed fellowships, to the 12 years of choosing him over every opportunity that would have chosen her by having an affair with a business partner, and telling his wife of 18 years that he had outgrown her. He put both hands flat on the table. He did not allow himself to look at Emily right now, because he had already reached the limit of what he could hold in this room, and if he looked at her again, he was not going to be able to maintain the composure that the moment required. He stared at the table. Graham beside him was very quiet. He had stopped functioning as a strategist and had shifted into something more like a witness. He understood with the reading of the room that 30 years of practice had given him that the proceeding had moved past the point where strategy was the primary language being spoken. The judge addressed the room. Procedural matters, scheduling the afternoon session, whether both parties wished to take a short recess before testimony continued. Thomas said his client was ready to continue. Graham said his client would appreciate a 15-minute recess. The judge granted it, and Daniel was on his feet before the gavel landed, moving toward the door, needing air, needing the corridor, needing 3 minutes without anyone looking at him. He made it to the same corner by the same window at the far end of the hall. He stood there. He had his back to the corridor, and he was looking out the window, and for a long moment he was not thinking about the case or the assets or the legal strategy or the afternoon's testimony or any of the practical machinery of the day. He was thinking about a night in 2007. He and Emily had been invited to a dinner party at the home of a client, one of Daniel's early investors, a man named Frederick Olson, who lived in Lincoln Park, and threw the kind of dinners where the food was excellent and the conversation was aggressive, and the unstated goal was for everyone to leave knowing that Frederick Olson was the most important person in the room. Emily had come with Daniel. She had worn a blue dress. She had sat beside him and been warm and attentive and entirely herself, which meant she had asked thoughtful questions and listened to the answers and not competed for space. Toward the end of the evening, Frederick had asked her what she did. She had said she worked at the Newberry Library in archival research. Frederick had nodded with the particular smile of someone who considers that charming and small in equal measure. Daniel had seen that smile, and he had felt in that moment a flicker of something he hadn't fully examined at the time, something that was not quite embarrassment, but was adjacent to it. A wish that her answer had been different, more impressive, more legible to the room. He had never said that to her. He had never needed to. She had felt it. He understood that now. She had felt it the way a person feels the temperature change in a room without anyone opening a window or saying a word. She had felt it, and she had chosen not to make it a confrontation, because confrontation was not how Emily operated. She operated by continuing to be who she was, and trusting that eventually the person beside her would see what that was worth. He had not. Footsteps behind him. Not Graham this time. He turned. It was Rachel, his junior associate. 28 years old, 3 years into her legal career, smart and disciplined, and absolutely not paid to have opinions about her client's personal life. She was holding a folder, but she wasn't looking at it. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. "Rachel." She hesitated. The professional hesitation of someone stepping toward a line they know is there. "This isn't my place," she said. "I know that. Say what you're going to say." She looked at him for a moment. "My grandmother," she said, worked for 40 years in a hospital, medical records. She organized intake forms and patient histories and filing systems, and she did it without anyone ever calling it important. She raised 3 kids. She put my father through school. She never asked for recognition. She paused. She died last year, and at her funeral there were 47 nurses and doctors who came on their own time because she had spent 40 years making their jobs possible. Nobody had told them to come. They came because she mattered. She stopped. Daniel looked at her. "I just thought you should know," she said, that some people in that room this morning have someone like that in their lives, and they recognized her. She handed him the folder she was carrying, a procedural update, something about the afternoon schedule, and walked back toward the courtroom. Daniel stood there with the folder in his hands. He thought about the 47 nurses and doctors at Rachel's grandmother's funeral. He thought about Emily's grandmother, Margaret Hargrove, who had preserved a letter in a trust document, who had written a notation beside it, who had understood better than anyone what her granddaughter was made of. He thought about the blessing Emily had asked for. He thought about what it meant that Margaret had given it. He put the folder under his arm. He walked back toward the courtroom. When he came through the door, the afternoon session was preparing to begin. Thomas Caldwell was arranging papers. The court clerk was at her desk. The journalist in the gallery had a fresh page open, and Emily was at her table. She was not looking at the door. She was looking at something Thomas had placed in front of her, a document of some kind, something she was reviewing with the careful attention she brought to everything she read. Daniel sat down. He looked at the back of her head, at the simple way her hair was pulled back, at the navy blue coat she had probably owned for several years, and would probably own for several more because it was practical and kept her warm, and she was not a person who discarded things just because newer versions existed. He thought about every party he had stood beside her at, willing her to be different. He thought about every morning she had been herself anyway. He thought about the fellowship she had declined. He thought about the night she had sat on the kitchen floor with him and said it was going to be okay. And then, because he was Daniel Whitmore, and he had built 20 years of a company on the ability to make decisions in difficult rooms, he picked up a pen, wrote 4 sentences on a notepad, tore the page off, and slid it to Graham. Graham read it. He looked at Daniel. Daniel held his gaze. Graham looked at the note again. Then he placed it very carefully in the center of his legal pad, capped his pen, and said in the quietest possible voice, "You're certain?" "Yes," Daniel said. "This ends the litigation," Graham said. "Today, if we do this." "I know," Daniel said. "Good." Graham looked at him for one more beat. Then he stood and addressed the judge. "Your Honor," he said, "before the afternoon session begins, the respondent would like to make a proposal." Thomas Caldwell looked up. Emily looked up. The judge said, "Mr. Pierce." Graham said, "Mr. Whitmore would like to propose a full settlement to be finalized today, in which all disputed assets are divided according to Mrs. Whitmore's original request, with no contest, no further litigation, and one additional provision." Thomas said carefully, "What provision?" Graham looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at Emily. She was watching him with the focused, clear attention she had given him all day, the attention that did not soften and did not harden and did not perform anything, just looked. He said to her directly across the courtroom, without going through counsel or the judge or any of the procedural apparatus of the room, "I want the record to state that Whitmore Group was built on your foundation, not mine, yours, and that I should have said that a long time before today." Emily looked at him for a long time. The courtroom waited. Thomas Caldwell said nothing. He was watching his client the way an attorney watches a client in a moment that belongs entirely to the client. And Emily Whitmore, who had walked into this room that morning, carrying an old leather folder and 18 years of things she had never needed anyone to know, who had sat quietly while her husband laughed at her, who had held her hands still on that folder and waited for the truth to speak for itself. Emily Whitmore looked at the man across from her and said clearly and quietly into the complete silence of that room, "I know you should have." She paused. "But thank you for saying it now." And somewhere in the gallery, someone exhaled, long and slow, like the release of something held too tightly for too long. The judge looked at both sides. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "does Mrs. Whitmore wish to proceed with the settlement proposal?" Thomas leaned toward Emily. She spoke quietly in his ear. He listened. He sat back up. "Yes, Your Honor," he said. "Mrs. Whitmore accepts, with one condition of her own." Graham said, "What condition?" Thomas looked at Emily. Emily said for the second time in that courtroom in her own voice, without notes or preparation or the protective formality of legal language, "I want his company to stay his. I don't want it. I never wanted it." She looked at Daniel. "I want what I came in with. My family's trust, my grandmother's legacy, what belongs to me." She paused. "And I want an honest accounting, not for the money, for the record, so that what actually happened is what the record says happened." She looked at the judge. That's all." The judge made notes. Graham and Thomas exchanged several careful procedural sentences about documentation and timeline, and Daniel Whitmore sat in that courtroom and understood with the full clarity of a man who had spent the morning being wrong about everything that the woman he had called ordinary for the last decade of their marriage had just walked away from a claim that could have taken everything he had. Not because she couldn't, because she didn't want it, because she had never wanted his empire. She had wanted the man she married. And since that man was not available anymore, since he had been replaced gradually and then completely by someone she didn't recognize, she was taking what was hers and leaving, with her dignity entirely intact, and his remarkably more intact than it deserved to be, because of her, even now, even here, still because of her. The settlement paperwork took 4 hours to finalize. 4 hours of legal language being shaped into something both sides could sign, of Thomas Caldwell and Graham Pierce working through the conference room down the hall from the courtroom with the careful precision of two attorneys who understood that the emotional center of this case had already been decided and that their remaining job was simply to build a document around it that would hold. Daniel sat in the conference room for most of it. I was not needed for the majority of the technical work that was what attorneys were for, but he had asked to stay. Graham had raised an eyebrow at that. Typically, clients were sent to wait somewhere comfortable while their legal teams worked. Typically, Daniel would have been in a car heading back to his office, his phone already active, the morning's events already being processed and filed away in the particular way that busy men file away things that are too large to look at directly. He stayed. He sat at the end of the conference table with a cup of coffee that went cold and a legal pad. He wrote nothing on, and he listened to the back and forth of settlement language, and he said yes when Graham asked him to confirm provisions, and he initialed where he was told to initial. And in between those moments he thought about Carla. That was her name, the business partner, the woman for whom he had decided his marriage was something he had outgrown. Carla Voss, 34 years old, sharp, ambitious, the kind of presence that filled a room the way a new building fills a skyline, impossible to ignore, designed to be noticed. She had come into his professional life 3 years ago through a mutual contact in the development industry, and she had been exactly what Daniel had told himself. He needed someone who spoke his language fluently, who understood the architecture of his world, who made him feel like the most current version of himself, rather than a man approaching 50 who had been having the same dinner party conversations for a decade. He had told himself it was intellectual connection. He had told himself the marriage had simply run its course. He had told himself that people grow in different directions, and that there was no villain in a story where two people simply wanted different things. He had told himself a great many things. Sitting in that conference room, listening to Thomas Caldwell confirm the valuation of the Hargrove Trust assets with the same measured quiet he brought to everything, Daniel thought about the last conversation he'd had with Carla before this hearing. She had called him the night before. "How are you feeling about tomorrow?" she had asked. "Ready," he had said. "It's going to be straightforward." She had said, "Good. Graham's the best. She doesn't have a real case." He had agreed. He had felt certain. Sitting in this conference room, he turned that certainty over in his hands like an object he was trying to understand the shape of. How had he been so certain he had known Emily for 18 years? He had lived in the same house with her, eaten at the same table, slept in the same bed. How had he spent 18 years with a person and understood so little about who she actually was? The answer arrived the way answers sometimes do not, as a revelation, but as an acknowledgement of something already known. He had stopped looking. That was all. It wasn't complicated. It wasn't a mystery. He had fallen in love with Emily when he was a struggling entrepreneur with nothing but ambition and need, and in that state, vulnerable, uncertain, dependent on the kindness of the people around him, he had seen her completely. He had seen her the way a person sees everything clearly when they have nothing to protect. Then he had built things, and the building had given him walls, and the walls had given him a version of himself that needed to be maintained, and maintaining that version required a certain careful management of what he allowed himself to see, because some things, Emily's quiet depth, her sacrificed fellowships, the letter to her grandmother, the $1.2 million given without expectation. Some things, if he had seen them clearly, would have required him to be a different kind of man than the one he had decided to become. So he had stopped looking. Not deliberately, not with malice, with the gradual, comfortable negligence of a person who has learned that some truths are easier to live beside if you never fully face them. Daniel, Graham's voice. The provision about the trust assets. I need you to confirm the language. Daniel looked up, confirmed the language, initialed the page. Graham went back to his conversation with Thomas. Daniel went back to his thoughts. I thought about what Emily had said in the courtroom. I want what I came in with. My family's trust. My grandmother's legacy. What belongs to me. She had not wanted his company. She had not wanted revenge. She had not wanted to watch him lose. He had walked into that courtroom certain she had nothing. She had walked in carrying hundreds of millions of dollars and a lifetime of sacrifices and 18 years of being seen incorrectly by the person who was supposed to see her best. And what she had asked for was honesty, an honest accounting, not for the money, for the record. He thought about what that said about her. He thought about what his own behavior had said about him. His phone buzzed on the table. He looked at it. Carla. He declined the call. She called again. He declined again. After the third attempt, a message appeared. How is it going? Call me when you're done. He set the phone face down on the table. Thomas Caldwell looked up from his papers, caught Daniel's eye briefly and looked back down. Thomas had not said anything to Daniel that was not strictly professional since the morning session. He had not offered reassurance, had not been openly hostile, had made no speeches. He was simply doing his job with the thoroughness he always brought to it. But in that brief look, Daniel read something that he thought was accurate. Thomas Caldwell had known walking into that courtroom this morning exactly what was in that leather folder. He had spent 8 months preparing it. He had read Emily's letter to her grandmother. He had traced every financial transfer. He had cataloged every declined professional opportunity. He had known the full shape of his client, and he had chosen to represent her. Daniel thought there was something in that, in the fact that a man who had seen the complete picture had chosen Emily's side without hesitation. That was its own kind of verdict. The paperwork was finished at 4:17 in the afternoon. Thomas gathered his copies with the same unhurried efficiency he brought to everything. Graham organized Daniel's set into a folder with the practiced motion of a man who had closed many cases in many conference rooms and knew exactly how to make an ending feel complete. Daniel signed the final page. He put the pen down. Graham extended his hand across the table to Thomas, who shook it. Brief, professional, the handshake of two attorneys acknowledging a concluded proceeding. Thomas, Graham said. Graham, Thomas said. That was all. Daniel stood. He buttoned his jacket, the automatic motion of a man reaching for the familiar armor of presentation, and then he stopped. He sat back down. Graham looked at him. 1 minute, Daniel said. Graham understood. He and Thomas both made their way toward the door, with the discreet efficiency of people who have learned when a room needs to be cleared. The door closed. Daniel sat alone in the conference room, with 4 hours of paperwork and the signed settlement agreement and the cold cup of coffee and the legal pad with nothing written on it. He sat there for a moment. Then he picked up the pen. He wrote on the legal pad. Not legal language, not business language, not the kind of language he used in meetings or profiles or dinner party conversations. He wrote, the fellowship she didn't take was in 2003, the year her grandmother died, the year she became the beneficiary of the trust, the year she could have walked away from everything and done exactly what she wanted to do. She didn't. He stared at what he'd written. He turned the page. He wrote, she paid the electric bill in January 2008. I didn't know until tonight that she used her personal account because the joint account was overdrawn. She didn't say anything. She just paid it. I found out because I was looking through old records during the prep for today. I thought I knew everything about those years, about how hard they were, about what I carried. I didn't know. He set the pen down. He folded both pages, put them in his breast pocket. I was not going to send them to anyone. He was not going to turn them into a gesture or an apology letter or a communication of any kind. He was simply going to carry them. He thought that was probably appropriate. In the corridor outside the conference room, he found Graham waiting. Car's outside, Graham said. In a minute, Daniel said. Graham paused. Daniel, I know. The case is closed, signed, filed. It's done. I know, Daniel said again. Graham studied him with the expression of a man who has watched many clients walk through many endings and has learned to recognize the ones who come out of it, changed versus the ones who come out of it the same. He said quietly, for what it's worth. What you did in there today, standing up, saying what you said. Daniel waited. It was the right thing, Graham said. It didn't help us legally, but it was the right thing. Daniel nodded. It was overdue, he said. Graham looked at him for one more moment. You ready? He said. No, Daniel said honestly, but let's go. They walked toward the elevator, and as they walked, Daniel did something he had not done since early that morning. He thought about the next day. Not strategically, not professionally, just the plain fact of it that tomorrow would come and the day after that, and the company would still be there and the work would still be there and his life, which he had built into an architecture he had been proud of, would continue to exist in its current form. And inside that life, there would now be a courtroom on record, a settlement document, an honest accounting, and a version of himself that had stood up in a room full of people and admitted he was wrong. He didn't know yet what to do with that, whether it was the beginning of something or simply the end of something, whether the version of himself that had stood up in that courtroom was a better man or just a man who had finally been caught. He didn't know, but he thought about Emily, walking out of that same building an hour earlier with Thomas Caldwell beside her and her old leather folder under her arm. He hadn't seen her leave. He had been in the conference room when the session formally concluded and the gallery cleared, but he had heard the door open and close. He had known by the quality of the silence that followed that she was gone. He thought about where she was now, probably driving back to the apartment she had rented after he moved out. A place in Wicker Park that Thomas had mentioned in passing during the proceedings. She had rented it, furnished, moved in with 2 suitcases and her books, and the ceramic lamp she had bought at an estate sale in 2014 that he had always thought was ugly, and she had always thought was exactly right. He thought about her in that apartment, setting down the folder, taking off the navy blue coat, making tea. Probably she had always made tea when she needed to process something, standing at the kitchen counter with both hands around the mug, thinking. He thought about what she was thinking right now. He thought about whether she was okay. And then he thought about the fact that until approximately 8 hours ago, it had not occurred to him to wonder whether she was okay. He had been so certain she was fine. So certain she was simply the quiet background of a life he had moved past. He had constructed a version of her in his mind that was contained and stationary, a person who would absorb the dissolution of their marriage and arrange herself neatly into whatever space remained without requiring anything from him, without demanding to be seen. He had been wrong about her in the same way he realized for 18 years. He had kept expecting her to be less than she was, and she kept being exactly who she was regardless. The elevator doors opened. They stepped in. The lobby of the courthouse was busy with the late afternoon movement of people concluding their business with the legal system, attorneys with briefcases, families looking strained, clerks in transit between offices. The ordinary machinery of a building where difficult things happen every day. Daniel walked through it. Outside the car was waiting. He got in. The driver asked where they were headed. Graham gave the office address. Daniel stared out the window as the car moved into traffic. His phone buzzed again. Carla. He looked at the notification for a long moment. Then he put the phone in his jacket pocket, in the same pocket where the folded pages from the legal pad were sitting. He thought about what he was going to say to Carla. Not today. He wasn't going to say anything today. Today, he was going to go to his office and sit at his desk and look at the city he had spent 20 years building a business in, and he was going to allow himself to understand what had happened. But eventually, he was going to have to say something. Because Carla Voss was brilliant and ambitious, and had made him feel for 3 years like the most current version of himself. And all of that was true, and none of it had turned out to be the foundation he had thought it was, because a foundation, a real one, was not made of mutual recognition and shared professional language and the intoxicating feeling of being with someone who reflected back the image of yourself that you wanted most to believe in. A foundation was made of the things Emily had given him. Constancy. Belief that predates your success, the willingness to sit on a kitchen floor with you in the worst week of your life and tell you it's going to be okay. The willingness to give $1.2 million to a dream you believe in more than the dreamer does. He hadn't recognized that when he had it. I was recognizing it now in its absence, the way you recognize the quality of light in a room only after someone turns it off. The car stopped at a light. Daniel watched people crossing the street, regular people in regular coats going home from regular days. He thought about something Emily's attorney had said, not Thomas. The other voice, the one that had not been in the courtroom, that he had heard only in the documents. Margaret Hargrove, Emily's grandmother. The woman who had raised Emily with the philosophy that what you have is not who you are, that what you give is. What you give is. He thought about what he had given. Over 18 years. In a marriage with a woman who had given him everything she had, including things she had never needed to mention, never needed to prove, never needed to announce. He thought about what he had given her in return. He thought about the laugh in the courtroom that morning. The car moved through the intersection. His phone buzzed. Not Carla this time. His assistant with a list of afternoon messages that needed returning. He read through them. Business matters. Development inquiries. A call from a journalist at a Chicago business publication. The same journalist who had been in the courtroom gallery, he assumed requesting a comment on the day's proceedings. He typed a brief reply to his assistant. No comment today. Hold all non-urgent calls until tomorrow morning. He put the phone back in his pocket. Graham was on his own phone beside him, already working the next item on his day. Graham was a man who moved quickly between things, who had developed the professional capacity to leave one room completely when he entered the next. Daniel envied him that briefly. Then the car pulled up in front of the Whitmore Group building. He got out. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment before going in. The building was 10 stories glass and steel in the River North neighborhood that Daniel had chosen 12 years ago, when the company first had enough capital to justify real office space. He had stood on this same sidewalk on the day they signed the lease and felt something that he had described to Emily that night as proof. He had told her over dinner that this was proof, that the dream was real, that everything they had worked for was becoming concrete. She had reached across the table and put her hand over his. She had said, "I always knew it would." He had heard that as the supportive warmth of a spouse. He understood now that it was something more specific. She had always known it would, because she had stood in the parts of it that he hadn't been able to stand in alone, because the infrastructure of his certainty in the years before he had anything to be certain about had been built partly from her belief. He went inside. His assistant Marco was at his desk and immediately began the summary of afternoon messages with the efficiency of a person who understood his role as the organizing principle of a busy man's day. Daniel held up one hand. Marco stopped. "Give me an hour," Daniel said. "No calls, no interruptions." Marco, who had worked for Daniel for 7 years and had learned to read his moods with precision, looked at him for exactly 1 second and said, "Of course." Daniel went into his office. He stood at the window that looked out over the river. He thought about what came next. Not emotionally. That would take longer than an afternoon. But practically. The settlement was signed. The marriage was formally ending. The assets were being divided according to Emily's original request. The Hargrove Trust was untouched. It had always been untouched legally and morally, and the settlement simply made that explicit in the record. His company was his. He had that. He still had that. He thought about the first project Whitmore Group had completed after the 2009 infusion. A mixed-use development in Logan Square, 8 units of residential above 2 commercial spaces, small by current standards. At the time it had felt enormous. He had stood in the completed building and felt the specific pride of a person who has made something real out of something that existed only in their head. He had called Emily from the building. She had come. She had walked through every unit, asked questions about every decision. Why this ceiling height? Why this material? What was the reasoning behind the layout of the commercial spaces? She had not been performing interest. She had genuinely wanted to understand what he had built and why. He had loved her for that. Not the word love the way it sits in speeches and greeting cards, the active version, the verb. He had loved her in that building on that day. He could not identify precisely when he had stopped. I thought that was part of the problem. That there had been no single moment, no decisive turning point, no recognizable event around which he could organize an understanding of his own failure. It had been incremental, gradual, the quiet accumulation of small dismissals, her opinion not asked for her presence, not acknowledged her achievements, not inquired about, until the dismissals had become the relationship, and the relationship had become a habit, and the habit had become something he mistook for incompatibility. He had looked at 18 years of his own neglect and called it growing apart. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. Not Carla, not his assistant. A number he didn't immediately recognize. Chicago area code. He almost let it go to voicemail. Something made him answer. Daniel Whitmore, he said. A pause. Then a woman's voice, older, careful with the particular precision of a person who chooses words deliberately. Mr. Whitmore, my name is Patricia Shen. I'm a colleague of Emily's. We worked together at the Newberry for several years. Daniel said nothing. He waited. I apologize for calling directly, Patricia said. I got your number from, well, that doesn't matter. I want to say something to you, and I understand if you'd rather I didn't. Go ahead, Daniel said. A brief pause. I was there this morning, Patricia said. In the gallery. I came because Emily asked me to be there. Not for support, she didn't need that. She asked me to be there because she said there were things that were going to be said today that she wanted a witness to. Someone who had known her for a long time. Daniel moved to his desk and sat down. I've known Emily for 14 years, Patricia said. I knew her when she turned down the Smithsonian contract. I knew her when the Library of Congress fellowship came through and she said no. I was the colleague she wrote that letter to in 2007, the one that was submitted in court today, the one about Daniel's work needing to come first. Daniel pressed his hand flat on the desk. I want you to know something about that letter, Patricia said, about what came before it and after it. Tell me, he said, before she wrote it. Patricia said, she called me. We had lunch. She had just been offered the LOC fellowship, and she was, I want to be accurate, she was genuinely torn. This was the opportunity she had been working toward since graduate school. She knew it. I knew it. Everyone in our field knew it. She paused. She sat across from me at lunch and she said, Patricia, if I take this, Daniel loses the person who's keeping him together right now, and I don't think the company survives without that. And I said to her, I want to be honest about this. I said to her, Emily, are you sure he would do the same for you? Daniel stopped breathing for a moment. And she said, Patricia continued carefully, she said, I don't need him to. I need to be the kind of person who does this for the people I love. That's separate from what he would or wouldn't do. The office was very quiet. I disagreed with her, Patricia said. I thought she was sacrificing too much for someone who hadn't proven he deserved it. I told her that. She thanked me for my honesty, and she turned down the fellowship. A pause. I watched her make that choice, and 3 more like it over the next several years, and every time she framed it the same way, not as a sacrifice, but as a decision. As something she was choosing to do because of who she wanted to be, not because of what she expected in return. Patricia's voice was steady, but there was something in it. What I want you to know, Mr. Whitmore, is that I sat in that gallery today, and I heard Thomas lay out everything she gave up, and I want you to understand she was exceptional. Not ordinary exceptional, genuinely exceptional. The kind of mind that comes through a field once in a generation. The work she did at the Newberry, the research she produced, the archive systems she built, they're still being used. They'll be used for decades. She stopped. And she chose you over all of it. Daniel had not moved. I'm not saying this to punish you, Patricia said. What happened in that courtroom today, what you said, I saw it. I think it meant something. I think you meant it. She paused one final time. I'm saying this because I loved my friend for 14 years, and I watched her carry something that was too heavy to carry alone and never complain about it. And today, the truth came out, and I needed someone who wasn't in that room to say it directly. She stopped. The line was quiet. Daniel said, Thank you, Patricia. Patricia said, Take care of yourself, Mr. Whitmore. The call ended. Daniel set the phone on the desk. He sat in his chair in his office on the 9th floor of a building in River North, looking at a city he had spent 20 years convincing to take him seriously. He had the company, he had the building, he had everything he had walked into that courtroom intending to keep, and the woman who had made it possible to keep it had walked out of that courtroom with her grandmother's trust and her dignity, and 14 years of a friend who had watched her be exceptional and never once doubted what she was worth. He pulled the folded pages from his breast pocket. He added a third line. She chose me over all of it. He sat with that for a long time. The city moved outside the window. Cars and people and the river catching the late afternoon light in the way it did at this time of year, when the angle was right and the water held the color for a moment longer than you expected. He had shown Emily this view once, early in the tenure of this office. She had looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then she had said, You built something real, Daniel. He had taken that as confirmation. He understood now it was also a question. Whether the real thing he had built was the building and the company and the $60 million estate. or whether the real thing was something older and quieter and far more difficult to hold on to once you stopped paying attention to it. He knew which answer she had meant. He had just taken until today to hear it. 3 months after the settlement was signed, Daniel Whitmore did something he had not done in 11 years. He called his mother. Not a birthday call, not a holiday call, not the kind of call that exists to fulfill an obligation and lasts exactly long enough to feel like one. A real call. The kind where you sit down first, where you don't have another tab open, or a message waiting on the other screen, where you actually intend to be present for however long it takes. His mother, Ruth Whitmore, was 71 years old and lived in a house in Naperville that Daniel had bought for her 8 years ago, a gesture he had been proud of at the time, and that he now understood had been partly generosity and partly the particular kind of guilt that expensive gifts are very good at temporarily silencing. She picked up on the second ring. "Daniel," she said. Just his name, but the way she said it with the specific quality of a mother who has been waiting for a call she was not sure was coming, told him everything about how long the silence between them had actually been. "Hi, Mom," he said. A pause. "Are you all right?" she asked. It was the right question. It was the only question. And it was so direct, so without preamble or cushioning, that it hit him with the force of something aimed carefully. "No," he said. "Not entirely." Ruth Whitmore was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me." So he did. He told her about the courtroom. He told her about the leather folder. He told her about the $1.2 million and the fellowships Emily had declined and the letter to Margaret Hargrove and the $300,000 he had never accounted for and the moment he had stood up in front of a judge and admitted on the record that he had been wrong. He told her about the laugh. Ruth listened without interrupting. When he finished, there was a long pause. Then she said, "Daniel, do you remember what I told you the week before your wedding?" He thought. "You told me a lot of things that week." "I told you one specific thing," Ruth said. "I told you that Emily was the kind of person who would always give more than she received, and that your job, your only real job in that marriage, was to make sure she never felt alone in it." Daniel closed his eyes. "I remember," he said, and Ruth said. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Ruth said softly, "I liked Emily. I always liked Emily. Not because she was quiet or because she was agreeable or because she made things easy. I liked her because she was real. She never pretended to be anything other than what she was. And in my experience, that is the rarest quality a person can have." She paused. "I'm sorry it took a courtroom for you to see it." Daniel sat with that. "So am I," he said. They talked for another hour. Not about the settlement or the business or the legal details, about other things, about the years Daniel had been building his company and how little Ruth had seen of him, about his father who had died when Daniel was 32, who had been a man of very modest means and very large dignity, who had worked the same job for 29 years and never once described himself as ordinary. About what Ruth remembered of Daniel as a young man before the money, before the suits, before the car, with tinted windows. "You were kinder then," Ruth said, "not as an accusation, as a fact." "I know," Daniel said. "Kindness doesn't disappear," Ruth said. "It gets covered by busy and important and the need to always be winning something, but it doesn't disappear." When the call ended, Daniel sat in his apartment, not the house that was being sold as part of the settlement, but the apartment he had rented in the interim, a sleek, modern place in Streeterville that he had chosen quickly and without much thought, and that felt every morning when he woke up in it like a hotel room in a city he was only passing through, and he thought about what his mother had said. Kindness doesn't disappear, it gets covered. He thought about what else he had covered. The next morning he went to the office and called a meeting. Not his attorneys, not his financial team, his senior staff. The 7 people who had been with Whitmore Group the longest, who had built their careers alongside his, who had watched the company grow from a struggling operation in a rented workspace to a recognized name in Chicago development. He sat at the head of the conference table. He looked at them. And he said something that none of them expected to hear in a Monday morning meeting. He said, "I want to talk about how we got here." Marcus Webb, his VP of Operations, who had been with the company for 14 years and had the particular loyalty of a person who had watched Daniel at his worst and stayed anyway, said carefully, "How do you mean?" "I mean the beginning," Daniel said. "The real beginning. I've been telling a version of this company's story for 20 years, in interviews, in pitches, at dinners, and I've been telling it wrong." The table was quiet. "I've been saying I built this from nothing," Daniel said. "I didn't. I built this from something, from someone." He paused. "I want us to know that. Internally, I want the people in this room to know that the foundation of this company was not my intelligence, or my determination, or my vision, even though I believe all of those things were real. The foundation was a woman who believed in this company when no bank in Chicago would touch it. And I didn't acknowledge that, not once, not in 20 years. Marcus said nothing, but his expression shifted. Beside him, Renata Kim, the head of project development, who was 36, and had joined the company 6 years ago, and had never known the early years firsthand, leaned forward slightly. "Are you talking about Mrs. Whitmore?" she asked. "Yes," Daniel said. Renata looked at him carefully. "I heard about the hearing," she said. "People in the industry talked about it." "I know they did," Daniel said. "And I know how it looked, and I know how some of it was." He didn't soften that. "What I want to be clear about is this. Going forward, when this company tells its story to partners, to press, to anyone, the story is accurate. Emily Whitmore was a foundational contributor to this company's survival. That's the true version. We use the true version." The room absorbed this. Marcus said, "Okay, Daniel." Just that. "Okay, Daniel." The words of a man who had been waiting without knowing he was waiting for his employer to become honest about something he had always sensed but never been given permission to name. The meeting moved on to operational matters, project timelines, a new acquisition in the works, budget reviews, but something in the room had changed. The particular atmosphere of a team that has been organized around a version of events that everyone quietly suspects is incomplete, that atmosphere had shifted. Something had been set down, something that had been carried collectively without acknowledgement. When the meeting ended and the room emptied, Marcus stayed behind. He closed the door. Daniel looked at him. Marcus said, "I remember 2009. "I know you do," Daniel said. "I remember you coming in on a Monday in March and telling us the company was going to be fine, that the financing had been resolved, that we didn't need to worry about payroll." Marcus paused. "I always wondered where that came from. You never said." Daniel said, "I know." "I figured it was some private investor you didn't want to name," Marcus said. "I let it go because you seemed relieved wasn't the right word. You seemed like you'd been given something back that you hadn't expected to get." Daniel said nothing. "You had been," Marcus said. Not a question. "Yes," Daniel said. "I had." Marcus nodded slowly. Then he said, "She deserved better than what she got, Daniel." "Yes," Daniel said. "She did." Marcus picked up his folder. "For what it's worth, and maybe it's not worth much at this point, you're the only person I've ever worked for who stood up in a public setting and admitted he was wrong before he had to, before anyone forced him to." He opened the door. "That counts for something," he said. "I don't know how much, but it counts." He left. Daniel sat at the head of the empty conference table. He thought about what counts for something. He thought about whether it was enough. I thought that the honest answer was no. Not entirely, and that the honest answer was also that enough was not the right measure. The question was not whether what he had done was enough to balance what he had taken. That math would never work in his favor. The question was whether what he did next was going to be the action of a person who had learned something, or the action of a person who had been briefly humbled and then returned comfortable and unchanged to the life he had built. He did not want to be the second kind of person. He was not sure yet how to be the first. He was still working on it. 2 weeks later, Daniel received a letter. Physical letter, handwritten, delivered to his office through the law firm that had handled Emily's side of the settlement. Thomas Caldwell's office had forwarded it without comment. The handwriting on the envelope was not Emily's. He opened it. Inside was a single page written in the careful, deliberate script of a person who had grown up in a time when handwriting was considered a reflection of character. It was from Patricia Shen. She wrote that she was enclosing something Emily had asked her to pass along, that Emily had debated sending it and had ultimately decided that it was better for certain things to be said than to remain unsaid, even when the moment for them had technically passed. Folded inside Patricia's letter was a second page, Emily's handwriting. Daniel recognized it immediately. The slightly tilted letters, the way she crossed her T's with a line that went just a fraction too far to the right, the particular shape of her capital D. He had not seen her handwriting in months. He held the page for a moment before reading it. Then he read it. She had written, "Daniel, I've thought for a long time about whether to send this. I'm sending it because I think the truth should be complete. Not just the part that came out in the courtroom. All of it. The money was never the point. I want you to understand that. Not the trust, not the transfers, not the inheritance. Those were things I had. They didn't define what I chose to do with them. What I chose to do was believe in you. For 18 years I chose that, and I don't regret it. Not the fellowships, not the investments, not the years of being the person in the background while you were the person in the foreground. I made those choices with full knowledge. I would make them again for the version of you that existed when I made them. What I regret is simpler than money. I regret that I waited too long to tell you that I was disappearing. That should have been a conversation we had years ago. I should have said, Daniel, I am losing myself in this marriage and I need you to see that. I didn't say it. I thought love was supposed to be sufficient. I thought if I kept being who I was, eventually you would remember why you chose me. I was wrong about that too. So we were both wrong, in different ways at different costs, and now we are here. I want you to know one thing. The man you were in that courtroom on the day of the hearing, the man who stood up without being asked and said what was true, I recognized him. I had not seen him in a long time, but I recognized him. Take care of him. He is worth more than the one who laughed. E. Daniel read the letter twice. Then he folded it carefully and placed it with the pages from the legal pad that were still in his desk drawer. The pages where he had written, "She chose me over all of it," and the other things he had needed to write down because writing was the only way he knew to make something stay. He sat for a long time. The letter said I was disappearing. I thought about what that meant, the full weight of it. Not the abstract concept of a neglected spouse, but the specific lived reality of a person who had been in a marriage with him for 18 years and had at some point in some specific accumulation of specific moments begun to disappear. And he had not seen it, not because it was invisible, because he had not been looking. He thought about the morning of the courtroom. He had laughed. He had laughed because he was certain she had nothing. But the certainty itself, that unexamined automatic certainty, was the clearest evidence of how thoroughly he had stopped seeing her. A person who had been paying attention would not have been certain. A person who had been paying attention would have understood years before a courtroom that the woman he was married to was carrying something deeper and wider than anything he had given her credit for. The certainty had been the tell. It had always been the tell. He picked up his phone. He did not call Emily. He understood with the clarity that the letter had given him that calling Emily was not what this moment required. She had not written to reopen a door. She had written to complete a truth. There was a difference. He called his mother again instead. Ruth picked up on the first ring this time. "Daniel," she said. "I got a letter," he said. "From Emily." A pause. "What did she say?" He read it to her. When he finished, Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "She's right. About all of it." "I know," Daniel said. "The man she recognized," Ruth said. "In the courtroom. I raised that man. I know exactly who she's talking about." "I know you do," Daniel said. "The question," Ruth said carefully, "is not whether you can find him again. You already found him. You found him the moment you stood up without being asked." She paused. "The question is whether you keep him. Whether you choose him every day, going forward in the ordinary days, the ones that don't have an audience and a court reporter and a reason to be your best self." Daniel said, "That's a harder question." "Yes," Ruth said, "it is. All the real ones are." He thought about that. He thought about Carla. He had spoken to Carla 3 weeks after the settlement. She had come to his office. She had sat across from him with the composed, forward-leaning energy she always carried, and she had said, "So, now that it's done, where does this go?" He had looked at her. He had thought about Emily's letter, which he had not yet received, but which was already in some formless way, already present in the things Thomas Caldwell had said, in what Patricia Shen had told him on the phone, in the folded pages in his desk drawer. He had said, "Carla, I need to be honest with you." She had waited. He had said, "What I was looking for when I found you, I was looking for a mirror, someone who showed me back to myself in the version I most wanted to see. And you did that, and I mistook that for what I wanted from my life." Carla had been very still. "That's not the same thing as love," he said, "and you deserve someone who isn't confusing those two things." A long pause. Then Carla had said with the bluntness he had always respected in her, "You're breaking up with me because you're still in love with your ex-wife." He had started to say no. He had stopped. He had said, "I'm ending this because I need to understand who I actually am before I ask anyone to be with that person, and right now I don't fully know." Carla had looked at him for a long moment. Then she had stood up, picked up her bag and said, "For what it's worth, Daniel, the man you're describing, the one who doesn't know who he is, he's actually more interesting than the one I've been working with." She had left. He had not heard from her since. He thought about her now telling his mother about the conversation. Ruth listened. "She wasn't wrong," Ruth said, "about you being more interesting." Daniel almost laughed. Almost. "Mom," he said. "What?" "I think I've been the lesser version of myself for a long time," Ruth said without hesitation. "Yes, you have." He exhaled. "Okay," he said. "Okay," Ruth said, and in her voice was something that was not quite forgiveness, that would take longer for both of them, and they both knew it, but was the beginning of an opening. A door cracked. "Come see me," Ruth said. "This weekend. Bring nothing. No work, no phone calls, no arriving late because of something urgent. Just come." "Okay," he said. "I'll make your father's chili," she said. "The real version, not the version I make for company." He did go that weekend. He arrived on time. He left his laptop in the car. He sat in his mother's kitchen while she made the chili, and he did not check his phone, and they talked about his father, and about the years before the money, and about what Daniel remembered of being 25 and hungry, and certain that the only thing standing between him and the life he wanted was the right opportunity. And Ruth said at some point in the evening while they were washing dishes side by side, the way they had when he was a teenager, in a different house, in a different life. "Your father used to say that the real test of a man is not what he builds, it's what he protects." Daniel dried a bowl. "He meant us," Ruth said. "Me and you and your sister. He meant the people who didn't have anything to do with whether he succeeded or failed, but who were there regardless. The people who showed up not because of what he was worth, but because of who he was." She handed him another dish. "He protected us," she said. "Not perfectly, not without failures. But he knew we were the real thing. He never forgot that." Daniel set the dish in the cabinet. "I thought about his father, about the same job for 29 years, and the quiet dignity that had come with it. About the way his father had looked at his mother at the kitchen table every morning, just looked a glance that lasted half a second, and contained something Daniel had been too young at the time to name, but understood now completely. He had seen something worth protecting. Every morning, same kitchen, same half-second glance. He had never let himself forget it. Daniel had forgotten. He had built an empire and forgotten. That was the simplest version of everything that had happened, the version that fit on one line. He had built something enormous, and in building it had lost track of the thing his father had spent 29 years protecting. He thought about Emily in her apartment in Wicker Park. He thought about what she was building now, because she was building something. He knew that. Patricia had mentioned it in passing during their phone call, that Emily had begun consulting for a private foundation focused on historical preservation, that she was working on a project involving digitization of Midwest archival collections that she had been offered, and this time accepted a position advising on a major institutional archive project. She was doing her work, the work she had set aside for 18 years. She was doing it now. And he thought about what that meant, not for him, not in relation to anything he had done or not done, but simply for her. That the person who had spent 18 years choosing his dream over hers was now in the aftermath of the hardest year of her life, finally choosing her own. He thought that was the best possible outcome of the worst possible year. He thought she was going to be extraordinary. He already knew she had always been. 6 months after the settlement, an article appeared in a Chicago cultural magazine. It was a profile of Emily Whitmore, not Emily Whitmore, the divorce story, not Emily Whitmore, the heiress, but Emily Whitmore, the archivist, the researcher, the woman who had spent a career making invisible things visible, and who was now through the Hargrove Family Foundation funding the preservation of historical records that would otherwise be lost. The journalist who wrote the piece had been in the gallery the day of the divorce hearing. The article did not mention the hearing. It mentioned Emily's work at the Newberry. It mentioned Margaret Hargrove and the philosophy she had passed down. It mentioned the Foundation's first major project, a partnership with 3 Midwest universities to digitize and make publicly accessible a collection of industrial-era labor records that had been sitting in storage for 40 years. Near the end of the article, the journalist asked Emily what had driven her back to active work after years of stepping back. Emily had said simply, "I realized I had been waiting for the right time to do the things that mattered to me. And the right time is always now. It was always now. I just had to decide to see that." Daniel read the article in his office on a Thursday morning with coffee that was still hot. He read it twice. Then he sat back in his chair and looked out the window at the river, the same window he had stood at 6 months ago, trying to understand who he was in the aftermath of everything that had come apart. He thought about the right time being always now. He thought about his company. He thought about his mother's kitchen. He thought about the 3 folded pages in his desk drawer, the legal pad pages, and Emily's letter, and the sentence that lived in the middle of all of it. "Take care of him. He is worth more than the one who laughed." He opened his desk drawer. He took out the pages. He read them again slowly, the way you read something when you're trying to make sure the words stay. Then he picked up his phone and called Marcus. "I want to restructure the company's community giving," he said when Marcus answered. "Not a PR initiative, something real. I want to talk about partnering with the Hargrove Foundation." Marcus was quiet for exactly 1 second. Then he said, "I'll set up the meeting." "Not yet," Daniel said. "I want to reach out first, personally." Another pause. "Okay," Marcus said. "What are you going to say?" Daniel thought about that. What was he going to say? I was going to say that Whitmore Group wanted to support the preservation work the foundation was doing, not because it was good for the company's image, though it probably was, but because the work mattered, and because acknowledging that was part of becoming honest about where the company came from and what it owed. He was going to say it without expecting anything in return. He was going to say it because it was the true thing. "I'm going to say the truth," Daniel told Marcus. He called Thomas Caldwell's office and left a message. He did not call Emily directly. He understood the boundary. He respected it. The message he left for Thomas was professional and brief, a request to explore a corporate giving partnership between Whitmore Group and the Hargrove Foundation, entirely at the foundation's discretion, with no expectation of response. Thomas called back the next morning. "The foundation's director will take the meeting," Thomas said. "Emily has asked me to let you know she appreciates the gesture. She also asked me to tell you she will not be present at the meeting." "I understand," Daniel said. "She said to tell you," Thomas continued, and his voice carried the careful precision of a man reading something that was not his own words, "that the foundation accepts contributions based on the merit of the work, not the source of the money." Daniel said, "That sounds right." "She also said," Thomas continued, and I'm quoting here, "tell him I meant what I said in the letter." Daniel sat still for a moment. "Tell her I know," he said, "and that I'm working on it." The meeting with the foundation took place 3 weeks later. Daniel went alone. No marketing team, no PR consultant, no carefully prepared presentation about the benefits of the partnership to Whitmore Group's community profile. Just Daniel, a notepad, an honest conversation about what the foundation was building and how his company could support it. The foundation's director, a woman named Grace Okafor, who had the calm authority of a person who knew exactly what she was protecting, and why asked him one question at the end of the meeting that he had not prepared for. She said, "Mr. Whitmore, why does this matter to you personally?" He looked at her. He said, "Because the most important things I ever had were made possible by someone who believed in work like this, in the value of preserving what's true, and I didn't understand that for a long time, and now I do." Grace looked at him. She said, "That's a real answer." He said, "I'm trying to only give those now." The partnership was agreed to before he left the building. He drove back to his office through Chicago traffic, through the city he had spent 20 years convincing to take him seriously, through streets he knew and blocks he had developed, and neighborhoods where his company's work was visible in the buildings that lined them. He thought about all of it. He thought about his father's 29 years at the same job and the half-second glance at the kitchen table and what it meant to know the real thing and not let yourself forget it. I thought about Emily in her apartment doing her work, finally doing her work, building what she had always been meant to build. He thought about Ruth's chili and the folded pages in his desk drawer, and Marcus saying that counts for something, and the 47 nurses and doctors who had come to a funeral on their own time because a woman had spent 40 years making their work possible. He thought about a courtroom, a leather folder, a laugh he could not take back. I thought about what came after the things you cannot take back, and he understood sitting in traffic in a city that did not particularly care what he understood that what comes after is not redemption. Not the cinematic version, not the clean arc of a man who makes a mistake and corrects it and walks away restored. Life was not structured that way. People were not structured that way. What comes after is work. The daily, undramatic, unwitnessed work of becoming more honest than you were the day before, of looking at the people in your life and actually seeing them, of choosing in the ordinary moments that have no audience and no court reporter, to be the version of yourself that the people who love you most believed you were capable of being. His mother had said kindness doesn't disappear, it gets covered. He believed her, he was uncovering it. Not quickly, not perfectly, not with the satisfying completeness of a story that resolves in a single courtroom scene, but daily, deliberately, with the full knowledge of what it had cost to let it get covered in the first place. The traffic moved. Daniel Whitmore drove through his city, through the life he had built carrying 3 folded pages in his jacket pocket, and the beginning of something that looked for the first time in a long time like the truth. The man who laughed in that courtroom was not gone, but he was no longer in charge, and that finally was the most honest thing Daniel Whitmore had ever built.